December 2, 1941. 1,400 hours. 25 miles from Moscow. The temperature has dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. German forward reconnaissance units of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the village of Khimki, a suburb on Moscow's northwestern edge. Through their binoculars, they can see the spires of the Kremlin. One officer later writes in his diary, "We can see the city." After 6 months of advancing, Moscow is finally within reach. But we're frozen, exhausted, and alone. This moment represents the absolute high water mark of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. German forces are closer to Moscow than they will ever be again. Within 24 hours, a single decision, or rather, the absence of a decision, will determine the outcome of the entire Eastern Front. Hitler, 1,800 miles away in his East Prussia headquarters, faces the most critical choice of the war: order an all-out assault on Moscow with his depleted forces, consolidate positions for winter, or authorize a tactical withdrawal. For 24 hours, he hesitates. He debates. He demands more information. And in those 24 hours, the Red Army launches a massive counteroffensive that will drive German forces back 200 miles and ensure that Moscow will never fall. This is the story of how a single day of indecision lost Hitler the Eastern Front. To understand how Germany reached this moment and why the next 24 hours would prove catastrophic, we need to go back 6 months. June 22, 1941. 0315 hours. Operation Barbarossa begins. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,600 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, crash across the Soviet border on a 1,800-mile front. It's the largest military invasion in human history. Hitler's plan is audacious: destroy the Red Army in a single summer campaign lasting 6 to 8 weeks, capture Leningrad, Moscow, and the industrial heartland before winter arrives. The initial advance is stunning. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, drives 400 miles in 3 weeks. Entire Soviet armies are encircled and destroyed. By September, German forces have captured 3 million Soviet prisoners. Victory seems inevitable. But the campaign doesn't end in 6 weeks. Soviet resistance, though chaotic and costly, never collapses completely. New Soviet armies appear from beyond the Ural Mountains, replacing destroyed units. The vast distances of Russia stretch German supply lines to the breaking point. And most critically, the Germans waste precious weeks in August and September when Hitler diverts forces south toward Ukraine instead of concentrating everything on Moscow. When the final drive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, finally begins on October 2, the weather is already turning cold. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, is 53 years old, Germany's premier panzer tactician, the man who wrote the book on armored warfare. As his tanks drive toward Moscow in October, he grows increasingly concerned. His diary entries reveal mounting anxiety. October 12, mud is making movement nearly impossible. Vehicles are sinking to their axles. October 28, first snow has fallen. Men lack winter clothing. Frostbite cases appearing. November 15, temperature dropped to -20. Engine oil freezing. Tanks won't start without fires built underneath. But Hitler's orders are unambiguous: take Moscow before winter. The city is more than just a symbolic prize. It's the nerve center of the Soviet transportation network. 7 major railway lines converge there. Capturing Moscow would cripple Soviet logistics across the entire front. German forces converge on the city from 3 directions, from the northwest through Klin, from the west through Istra, from the southwest through Tula. By late November, they're fighting in Moscow's suburbs. The Soviet government has evacuated to Kuibyshev, 500 miles east. Demolition charges are placed on major buildings. Stalin remains in Moscow, but many believe the city will fall. Foreign diplomats are evacuated. Some Soviet units begin retreating without orders. For a brief moment in late November and early December, Moscow seems within Germany's grasp. But appearances deceive. What German intelligence doesn't know, what they catastrophically underestimate, is what's happening behind Soviet lines. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, 45 years old, has been appointed to defend Moscow. He's Stalin's best commander, a brutal tactician who will sacrifice any number of men to achieve an objective. Throughout November, while German forces batter themselves against Moscow's defenses, Zhukov is secretly assembling a massive counteroffensive force. Fresh divisions from Siberia, troops trained and equipped for winter warfare, are arriving by rail every day. The Japanese decision not to attack the Soviet Union in the east has freed 15 divisions from the Far Eastern Front. They're being transferred west. By early December, Zhukov has concentrated over 1 million men, 7,600 guns and mortars, and 720 tanks in reserve positions around Moscow. German intelligence estimates Soviet reserves at perhaps 200,000 men. They're off by a factor of 5. On December 1st, a German patrol captures a Soviet officer carrying documents that reveal the true scale of Soviet reinforcements. The report reaches Army Group Center headquarters. Field Marshal von Bock is alarmed. He calls Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at Hitler's headquarters, warning that German forces are dangerously overextended. We have neither the strength to attack Moscow nor the reserves to hold current positions if the Soviets counterattack, von Bock states. I request permission to withdraw to defensible winter positions. Keitel's response, the Führer will consider it. Maintain current positions. That's December 1, 1941. The critical 24 hours are about to begin. December 2, 1941. The critical day begins. At dawn, German forward units report they've reached Khimki, 25 kilometers from the Kremlin. It's the closest they'll ever get. But these aren't fresh assault divisions, they're reconnaissance elements, exhausted Kampfgruppen cobbled together from depleted units. The 2nd Panzer Division reports it has 35 operational tanks. It started the campaign with 200. The 7th Panzer Division has 40 tanks left. Infantry divisions report 50% casualties. Some battalions are down to 200 men, they should have 800. The cold is worse than the fighting. Men are suffering from frostbite by the thousands. Tanks won't start. Artillery breech blocks freeze solid. Machine guns jam from cold. Horses, the Wehrmacht still relies on horses for most logistics, are dying by the hundreds, unable to survive on frozen ground with inadequate feed. And the soldiers lack winter clothing. The Wehrmacht assumed the campaign would end before winter. There was no plan, no stockpile of cold weather gear. Men are wrapping newspapers under their uniforms for insulation. They're stealing felt boots from dead Soviet soldiers. Frostbite casualties exceed combat casualties in many units. At 0900 hours December 2nd, Field Marshal von Bock calls Hitler's headquarters again. He presents three options: launch an immediate all-out assault with every available unit, consolidate present positions for winter defense, or conduct an organized withdrawal to better defensive terrain. I need a decision, von Bock states. Today. We cannot remain in present positions, we're too weak. But any action requires authorization from the Führer. At Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia, the mood is tense. Hitler spends December 2nd in conferences with his staff. The consensus among professional military officers is clear: withdraw to defensible positions, prepare proper winter quarters, resume the offensive in spring. But Hitler cannot accept this. His entire strategic vision depends on defeating the Soviet Union in 1941. A winter pause means the Soviets gain time to rebuild. American entry into the war seems imminent. Japan is preparing to strike in the Pacific. If the war extends into 1942, Germany faces enemies on all sides. Hitler demands more information. How many tanks are operational? What are ammunition stocks? Can Moscow's defenses be broken with one more push? The questions go back and forth. Hours pass. And while Hitler debates in East Prussia, at the front, something ominous is happening. Soviet artillery fire is intensifying. Reconnaissance units report large Soviet troop movements. Red Army cavalry and ski troops are appearing in German rear areas, attacking supply columns. These aren't defensive actions, they're probing attacks, feeling for weak points. General Guderian, at his headquarters near Tula, south of Moscow, senses what's coming. He writes in his diary, "The Russians are preparing something big. I can feel it. We need to pull back now, while we still can." But no orders arrive. The 24-hour window extends into evening, and still no decision comes from Hitler. At 1800 hours December 2nd, the situation changes dramatically. Along the entire front north of Moscow, Soviet forces launch local counterattacks. These aren't the probing actions of the previous hours, these are battalion and regiment strength assaults. The 1st Shock Army attacks German positions around Yakroma. The 20th Army hits German lines near Krasnaya Polyana. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped with white camouflage and felt boots, advance through snow that Germans can barely move through. German units, strung out in exposed positions, attempt to hold. But they're outnumbered and exhausted. Some units break. Others conduct fighting withdrawals. Radio traffic becomes frantic. Units report being surrounded. Supply dumps are overrun. The carefully planned front line begins to fragment. At 2000 hours, Field Marshal von Bock calls Hitler's headquarters a third time. The conversation is recorded in the war diary. The enemy has begun a major offensive. My forces are too weak to hold present positions. I am ordering tactical withdrawals to shorten the front. I inform OKW as a courtesy, the situation requires immediate action. It's a calculated insubordination. Von Bock is making the decision Hitler won't make. But even this limited withdrawal authorization comes too late. The Soviet counteroffensive isn't a local action, it's a coordinated operation across 500 miles of front. And it's just beginning. December 3, 1941. The second day of the Soviet counteroffensive. While German commanders at the front struggle to contain multiple Soviet breakthroughs, Hitler finally makes his decision, but it's the worst possible choice. He issues an order: hold all positions. No withdrawals without express authorization from OKW. The army will dig in and defend current lines through the winter. It's a fantasy. The ground is frozen solid, soldiers cannot dig trenches. There are no prepared defensive positions. Supply lines are overextended and under attack. The order essentially tells German forces to stand still while being encircled and destroyed. General Guderian receives this order at 1000 hours December 3rd. His response is immediate and furious. He calls Field Marshal von Kluge, commander of the Fourth Army, "This order will destroy us. My southern flank at Tula is already collapsing. Soviet cavalry has broken through. If I cannot withdraw, my entire army will be surrounded." Von Kluge is sympathetic but bound by orders. Those are the Führer's direct commands. You must hold. Guderian makes a decision. Like von Bock before him, he chooses limited insubordination. He orders his most exposed units to conduct tactical adjustments, withdrawals disguised as position improvements. But it's piecemeal and chaotic. Some units receive withdrawal orders, others don't. The front fragments further. By December 4th, the scale of the Soviet offensive becomes clear. It's not just Army Group Center facing counterattacks. Soviet forces are attacking along the entire Moscow front. The Kalinin front attacks from the north. The Western front attacks from the center. The Southwestern front attacks from the south. Over 100 Soviet divisions are on the offensive. The human cost of Hitler's 24-hour delay and his subsequent order to hold all positions becomes catastrophic in the following weeks. German soldiers, trapped in exposed positions without winter fortifications, face temperatures that drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Entire battalions suffer 80% frostbite casualties. Men lose fingers, toes, ears, noses to cold. Field hospitals are overwhelmed. Morphine and medical supplies run short. Equipment failure becomes total. Tanks are abandoned when engines seize. Artillery cannot fire because lubricants freeze. Vehicles are burned for warmth. Supply convoys cannot reach forward units through Soviet cavalry raids and partisan attacks. Some German units go days without food. They slaughter their own horses for meat. They burn furniture, doors, fence posts, anything combustible, for heat. And they retreat. Despite Hitler's orders, the withdrawal becomes inevitable. Unit by unit, division by division, German forces pull back from Moscow. But it's not the organized, fighting withdrawal professional officers wanted on December 2nd. It's chaotic, costly, desperate. Units lose cohesion. Heavy equipment is abandoned. Wounded are left behind. Soviet forces pursue aggressively. Red Army cavalry exploits gaps in the German line, raiding headquarters, overrunning supply dumps, cutting roads. Soviet ski troops attack at night, appearing out of winter darkness. German commanders lose control of the situation. By mid-December, some German units have retreated 50 miles. The carefully planned encirclement of Moscow has become a desperate struggle to avoid encirclement themselves. On December 8, Hitler relieves Field Marshal von Bock of command.
The official reason is health. Von Bock has been suffering from stomach ailments. The real reason is that he advocated withdrawal when Hitler demanded standing fast.
On December 19, Hitler relieves Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, and assumes personal command of the Wehrmacht himself. When Guderian, without authorization, orders a withdrawal of his 2nd Panzer Army from Tula to avoid encirclement, Hitler personally relieves him of command on December 25, Christmas Day. In total, Hitler relieves 35 generals between December 1941 and February 1942. He punishes those who made the tactical decisions necessary to save their armies because those decisions violated his standfast order. The message to the officer corps is chilling: obey orders precisely, even if those orders are militarily insane, or face dismissal and disgrace. Initiative, the quality that made German armies formidable, is crushed. But what's lost in this command purge narrative is the human cost on the ground. Between December 1941 and March 1942, Army Group Center suffers over 400,000 casualties, roughly 40% of its strength. Of these, more than half are from frostbite, exhaustion, and disease rather than combat.
Entire divisions cease to exist as fighting units. The 267th Infantry Division is destroyed.
The 78th Infantry Division is reduced to 800 combat-effective men, less than a single battalion.
These aren't just numbers.
Their fathers, sons, brothers, German young men who advanced to within sight of Moscow and then froze to death in the retreat, because a 24-hour delay in decision-making destroyed any possibility of organized withdrawal to winter positions. From the Soviet perspective, the counteroffensive that began on December 5 to 6, 1941, represents one of the most significant victories in Russian military history. General Zhukov's carefully husbanded reserves, fresh Siberian divisions that German intelligence never detected to smash into overextended German positions at the moment of maximum German weakness.
The timing is perfect.
German forces are exhausted from 6 months of continuous offensive operations.
They're at the absolute end of their supply lines. They lack winter equipment. They're deployed in exposed, hard-to-defend positions optimized for attacking Moscow, not for defending against counterattack.
And critically, German commanders are paralyzed by Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawals.
Zhukov exploits all of this ruthlessly.
Soviet forces don't attempt to destroy German armies in place, they're not strong enough for that yet. Instead, they push German forces back, forcing them to abandon equipment, disrupting their logistics, preventing them from establishing winter defensive lines. By January 1942, Soviet forces have pushed German armies back 100 to 150 miles from Moscow.
The immediate threat to the Soviet capital is eliminated.
More importantly, the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility is shattered. For the first time in the war, German armies are in full retreat.
Stalin, encouraged by this success, orders Zhukov to continue the offensive, to liberate more territory, perhaps even to encircle and destroy Army Group Center entirely. But this is overreach.
The Red Army isn't yet strong enough for such ambitious operations.
The counteroffensive exhausts itself by March 1942. Both sides dig in. The front stabilizes.
But the strategic initiative has shifted.
Germany will never again threaten Moscow. Historians have debated for 8 decades, what if Hitler had made a decision on December 2nd? What if he'd authorized immediate withdrawal to prepared winter positions? What if he'd allowed his field commanders the flexibility to conduct fighting withdrawals? The consensus is that Germany still would have lost the Battle of Moscow. Soviet reserves were too strong, German forces too exhausted. But the cost would have been dramatically different. An organized withdrawal, beginning December 2nd or 3rd, would have saved tens of thousands of German lives and preserved combat units that were instead destroyed in the chaotic retreat. More critically, it would have preserved the professional officer corps that Hitler purged. Germany would have entered 1942 with more experienced commanders, more intact divisions, and a more flexible command culture. Would this have changed the ultimate outcome of the war? Almost certainly not. Germany faced impossible strategic challenges, fighting the Soviet Union, Britain, and soon America simultaneously, with inferior industrial resources. But the war might have lasted longer, cost more Allied lives, ended with different territorial boundaries. The 24-hour delay that became Hitler's stand-fast order represents something larger than a single tactical mistake. It represents the fundamental flaw in Nazi Germany's command structure, the concentration of all decision-making in one man who was not only geographically isolated from the front but also ideologically incapable of accepting military reality. Hitler couldn't authorize withdrawal because, in his worldview, German soldiers motivated by Nazi ideology should be able to overcome any material disadvantage through will alone. This belief in willpower over logistics, in ideology over military science, became more pronounced as the war continued. It would lead to disasters far larger than Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, the destruction of Army Group Center in 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Lieutenant Heinrich Hape, a German military doctor with the 6th Infantry Division, kept a detailed diary throughout the retreat from Moscow. His entries from December 1941 provide haunting insight into what the 24-hour delay cost at the individual human level. December 7th, we're retreating through villages we captured weeks ago. The temperature is -35. Men are collapsing from cold and exhaustion. I have no medicine left for frostbite. I tell them to keep moving. If you stop, you'll freeze to death where you stand. December 12th, our regiment has lost more men to cold than combat. This morning we found Corporal Mertens frozen to death at his post. He'd been on sentry duty, fell asleep, never woke up. He was 22 years old. His hands were still gripping his rifle. December 18th, we received orders to hold this position, a village with no name I can pronounce. But there's no food, no ammunition, no reinforcement. Just orders. Men are asking me, Herr Doctor, why are we still here? Moscow is gone. Why aren't we falling back to positions where we can survive the winter? I have no answer. December 24th, Christmas Eve. Temperature -40. We burned the last wooden furniture from the village. There's nothing left to burn. The men huddle together for warmth. Some are crying. Most just stare into nothing. This is the price of orders that make no military sense, issued by men 2,000 kilometers from the front who cannot conceive of conditions we endure. These diary entries were published after the war. They represent thousands of similar experiences, German soldiers trapped in impossible positions by a command structure that valued obedience over survival. From the Soviet perspective, the human cost was equally devastating, but borne with different context. Soviet soldiers defending Moscow understood they were fighting for their capital, for their families, for national survival. They knew what Nazi occupation meant. Millions of Soviet civilians had already perished in occupied territories.
This knowledge created a different kind of motivation than German soldiers felt.
Private Ivan Mikhailovich, a Soviet infantryman with the 32nd Rifle Division, wrote to his wife on December 8, "We've pushed the fascists back from our city. Yesterday we liberated a village they'd occupied for 2 months. What we found there, I cannot write to you. The civilians who remained are barely alive. The Germans took all food, all warm clothing. They left the people to starve and freeze. When I see this, I understand why we must not stop, why we must drive them back, no matter the cost." Soviet casualties in the winter counteroffensive were enormous, approximately 380,000 between December 1941 and March 1942. But unlike German casualties, which were increasingly from cold and disease as command paralysis prevented proper winter preparations, Soviet casualties were predominantly from combat. The Red Army was prepared for winter warfare. Soldiers had proper clothing, winter-capable equipment, and logistical support designed for extreme cold. They still died in large numbers. War is merciless regardless of preparation, but they died while advancing, liberating territory, driving back an invader. The difference in command structure mattered. Soviet commanders could make tactical decisions without referring every action to Stalin in Moscow. When Zhukov saw an opportunity, he could exploit it. When local commanders identified weaknesses in German lines, they could attack. The initiative that Hitler suppressed in his army, Stalin ironically permitted in his. By January 1942, the immediate crisis has passed for both sides. The front has stabilized roughly 100 to 150 miles west of Moscow. German forces have established winter defensive lines, though at tremendous cost. Soviet offensive operations continue, but with diminishing returns. The Red Army has outrun its own supply lines and exhausted its initial reserves. Both armies dig in for the remainder of winter. But the strategic situation has fundamentally changed. Germany has lost the initiative in the east. Before December 1941, German armies advanced. After December 1941, they will mostly retreat, with brief exceptions like the summer 1942 offensive toward Stalingrad. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, carefully cultivated through victories in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece, is shattered. German soldiers now know they can be defeated. Soviet soldiers know they can win. For Hitler personally, the Battle of Moscow reinforces all his worst instincts. He concludes that his standfast order, however costly, prevented a complete collapse like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812. He believes that will alone, his will, imposed through rigid orders, saved Army Group Center. This is tragically wrong. What saved Army Group Center was the professional competence of German officers and soldiers who implemented tactical withdrawals despite orders, who improvised winter positions despite lack of preparation, who maintained unit cohesion under impossible conditions. But Hitler doesn't see this. He sees that he ordered units to hold, and the front didn't collapse entirely, so his orders must have been correct. This false lesson will lead to even greater disasters. At Stalingrad in 1942-43, Hitler will again forbid withdrawal, and an entire army will be destroyed. In 1944, he'll declare fortress cities that must hold to the last man, ensuring their garrisons are annihilated rather than conducting fighting withdrawals. The question that haunts military historians is whether Moscow could ever have fallen, regardless of Hitler's decisions in December. The consensus increasingly is no. The Soviet Union in 1941 was not France in 1940. The USSR had strategic depth, vast territory to trade for time.
It had industrial capacity beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. It had a population of 190 million to Germany's 70 million.
Most critically, it had a political system that, however brutal, could enforce total mobilization and accept casualties that would break democratic governments. German planning for Operation Barbarossa was fundamentally flawed from the start. The assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse in 6 to 8 weeks, that victory could be achieved before winter, proved catastrophically wrong. When that assumption failed, Germany had no strategic alternative. The Wehrmacht lacked the logistics to supply armies operating 1,000 miles from German railheads. It lacked the winter equipment for a winter campaign. It lacked the manpower to occupy and control vast Soviet territories while also maintaining offensive operations. But Hitler's 24-hour delay in December 1941, and the standfast order that followed, transformed an inevitable strategic failure into an immediate, costly disaster. If German forces had conducted an organized withdrawal starting December 2nd or 3rd, before the Soviet counteroffensive reached full strength, they could have retreated to the Mozhaevsk defense line, 40 miles from their furthest advance. This line had prepared fortifications, better supply access, and more defensible terrain. Casualties would have been perhaps half what they actually were. Divisions that were destroyed could have been preserved. The professional officer corps that Hitler purged could have retained command. The individual fates of the commanders involved in the December crisis tell their own story about the nature of Hitler's Germany. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, relieved of command in December 1941 for advocating withdrawal, was eventually given another command in 1942, Army Group South. He was relieved again in July 1942 when he disagreed with Hitler's strategic direction. He survived the war but died in 1945 when his car was strafed by British aircraft, days after Germany's surrender. General Heinz Guderian, relieved of command on Christmas Day 1941 for ordering unauthorized withdrawals that saved his army, remained in disgrace until March 1943, when Hitler recalled him as Inspector General of Panzer Troops. Guderian tried to rebuild Germany's armored forces, but by then the war was lost. He survived the war and wrote influential memoirs about panzer tactics. General Georgy Zhukov, whose carefully planned counteroffensive exploited Hitler's indecision, went on to become the Soviet Union's most successful commander. He would lift the siege of Leningrad, win the Battle of Kursk, and ultimately command the final assault on Berlin. After the war, Stalin grew jealous of Zhukov's popularity and sidelined him, but he survived Stalin and was rehabilitated, dying in 1974 as a Soviet hero. And Hitler? The Battle of Moscow was his first major strategic defeat, but he learned nothing from it. His response to failure was to centralize control further, to dismiss competent officers, to insist that will could overcome material reality. This pattern would repeat until April 1945, when, in his bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet forces closed in, he still issued orders to non-existent armies, still blamed his generals for defeats caused by his own decisions, still believed ideology could defeat reality. Today, if you visit the fields outside Moscow where German forces reached their closest point in December 1941, you'll find monuments, both Russian and German. The Russian monuments commemorate the defenders of Moscow, the soldiers who stopped the fascist invasion. The German monuments, placed more recently, are simpler. They mark where German soldiers fell, far from home, in a war they didn't start but were sent to fight. At Khimki, the suburb where German reconnaissance units could see the Kremlin through their binoculars on December 2nd,
there's a memorial stone marking the furthest point of the German advance. Russian schoolchildren visited on field trips to learn about the Great Patriotic War.
The lesson they're taught is about Soviet resilience, about defending the motherland.
But there's another lesson in that stone, one that transcends nationality, the lesson of how leadership failures cost lives, how strategic indecision at critical moments can turn battles into disasters, how soldiers pay the price for their commanders' mistakes.
Hitler's 24-hour delay in December 1941 didn't lose him Moscow, he was never going to capture it.
But it transformed an inevitable strategic setback into a catastrophic defeat that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and destroyed any remaining chance of German victory in the East. The soldiers who froze in the snow outside Moscow, German and Soviet alike, deserve to be remembered not as heroes or villains, but as human beings caught in a war shaped by decisions made far from the front lines, often by men who never grasped the reality their soldiers faced. That's the real lesson of December 1941, that in war, timing is everything, leadership matters, and the cost of bad decisions is always paid by those with the least power to make them.